So as he said, I'd worked at these various companies for most of my professional life. I've kind of gone over to open source to kind of atone for my sins. These companies were cool when I was young. They're less cool now. I've now partially retired. I do mentoring for young UX designers. I work with Mastodon and Home Assistant. And the reason why I think I'm here, though, is that back in the 80s and the 90s, I worked at Apple, and I did an awful lot of work on desktop UX. So I've got some war stories to tell and things like that. And one of the things that I thought was interesting to bring up was back, I'd actually forgotten that I'd made this change to the Finder back in the early 80s. Basically, what happened was the Finder team found out that the name wasn't going to fit, and they wanted to put ellipses on the end of the file. And I was like, "There's just too much critical information here, so why don't you put the ellipsis in the middle?" And the Finder team was so easy to work with, and they were like, "Cool," and they implemented it within like a day or two. And I promptly forgot all about it. And then about last year, someone was saying, "Here's a good example of why the Mac UI is so all the attention to details." I'm like, "Oh." I did that, and I'd forgotten, and it's so fun to see that code that you had an impact on 40 years ago is still running. It's kind of fun, but it's also, though, I think a good sign of how subtle a lot of details are for desktop UX. And here's another one where if you want to drag an icon from the background window to the foreground, on the Mac it's possible. On almost every Linux system, you cannot do this because the window comes forward on mouse down, not mouse up. And I've complained about this. Turns out KDE saw my post and they actually fixed it, so go KDE. But the other point I want to make is this just isn't a convenience for small screens. This actually was primarily done on the Macintosh because you could drag files into application windows. And this is what I mean by desktop UX being enabling to users. This isn't just a little file thing, because when you talk to a Linux person, they're like, well, I don't drag icons. I use the command line. Who cares? It's like, this is what enables other kinds of user experience things. And no, I understand that you can't drag files into many Linux systems. A whole other conversation we should have. But my point is, good desktop UX enables new ways of moving data and handling things. So my point here is that desktop UX has not meaningfully changed in 20 years. And it's not just simply things like Windows and window managers. We don't need another. We already have like, what, 36 window managers? We don't need a 37th window manager. My point here is these fundamental low-level aspects have not really changed in a very long time. And so the structure of this talk is to go in this circle and to talk about why this is a problem and to work our way around to eventually some possible solutions. So the UX was initially copied. UX for Ubuntu and others was copied from the Windows and the Mac. And I don't mean this as a criticism. This is actually a compliment. In fact, it's exactly what Steve Jobs said. He admitted that he copied from Windows, from Xerox PARC. And he actually quoted Pablo Picasso by saying, good artists copy and great ones steal. And I think what he meant by that was good artists naively copy and great artists creatively steal, because the Xerox Star was pretty cool when it came out, and the Mac clearly copied it, but it was a very creative copy, right? They went from 2 buttons to 1 button. They changed the location of the menu bar. They did lots of very opinionated things, whereas Windows, it was just an ugly copy, right? And it's pretty easy to poke fun at that now. And of course, things improved over time. And then when other Linux systems came along, these things had been around for a little while, and it made sense to copy it. Why would you want to reinvent the wheel at that particular point? It made sense. Now, as things progressed over the years, clearly things like, I believe, like virtual desktops came from the Linux community, and that worked its way back again. But at that point, we're now kind of polishing the razor. There are smaller edge things that improved. So the copying went the other direction. But the fundamental, I would call, deep UX concepts of how dragging in mice and keyboards and text editing was fundamentally started back here and copied through here. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that these guys aren't doing anything interesting right now. And it's basically by copying is such a powerful thing, especially for open source, because it gives you cover. Right? If they try something first and you can check it out, it allows you to know it's a good idea. Like, who wants to experience Clippy all over again, right? Or is that reference too old for this room? I'm sorry. Okay. Okay. it's very helpful to have somebody go first, right? And that gives us a lot of creativity to play. So I'm saying that these guys were a great thing for us to draft behind, and it's okay to do that. Now, the reason why I'm so frustrated with Apple is that they made their play back in 2017 when they really went all in on the iPad. They hated the Macintosh. The Macintosh was getting hardly any love back then. Did anybody see this ad called What's a Computer? It basically was a young student was going through her day doing all these really cool things on an iPad, and it was really delightful. And at the very end of the day, she's typing in the backyard, and a neighbor leans over the fence and kind of goes, "Oh, what you doing on your computer?" And she turns so innocently and goes, "What's a computer?" Just twists the knife, you know. It's like, "Oh, you're an old person. You think it's a computer." And of course, the point was that that didn't work, right? iPad sales are down. Their UX is different than desktop UX, and it is good for many things, but it's clearly not winning over hearts and minds. And the fact that they actually make you pick your window manager when you boot is just the ultimate UX sin, right? UX designers in general don't like to like settings that much. I realize that's not a popular opinion here. But the idea, though, is that Apple basically has just given up. And of course, who doesn't love liquid glass? I mean, if all you're doing, if your big claim to fame to your operating system is that you've got some fancy shiny pixels, you've really lost the plot. So I think there's very little leadership that comes from them. I don't think Microsoft is doing, frankly, that much better either. The thirsty OneDrive and Edge signups are not very popular. Recall, which, by the way, was an awesome concept, but very poorly executed, and the end-of-life disasters have not been enamoring people with that. And so my little inside story is that I interviewed to be the head of Windows UX 8 years ago. And they flew me up, and I talked to all the senior VPs, and it was a very educational experience. It's not cool to spill the tea, so I have to be careful about what I say. But let's just say that when you go in there, you go in with a point of view, because they're not going to hire somebody who says, well, whatever you want. I came in there with something I want to do. And I basically talked about what I'm talking about here. We needed to really move the UX forward, fundamentally change it. And they didn't want to do that. And so I got a very polite email saying, thank you very much. You challenged us in very good ways, but we want to go. And I totally dodged a bullet. I'm so glad that didn't work. But I want to make sure that I'm really clear here that not of all Windows is that way. These guys are awesome, right? I mean, I want to say that this, we could actually build some really cool stuff on top of that, but they're not the mainstream, and I hope they do more mainstream stuff, but I want to make sure I don't throw any shade towards these guys. So my point here is there isn't anything left to copy, and I think that's a bit of an issue. And whenever I say that, I tend to get 3 different replies. First one is, okay, boomer. You know, like mobile one, desktop is old. What's the point? Let's just work on that. And I'm like, well, of course mobile won, but it won consumers. It didn't win productivity. You don't see huge consulting companies with people designing industrial products on their phones. It's like, no, you need the big screens. You need the big keyboards. People completely underestimate desktop as to how powerful it is because it's boring and everybody wants the cool shiny thing. The other answer I get is, it's a standard. You know, there's nothing more to do. We don't want to let you make any more changes. And if you've been in the UX, if you've been in the tech business for more than, 18 months, you know that this is a very, very bad idea, right? Because CD-ROMs were standard before it came along, and the BlackBerry was standard before the iPhone came out. And I am not one of those people that likes change for change's sake. I'm not a technologist in that sense. I think, though, that there are user pain points, things that our users are frustrated with today that can be fixed. And to just sit back and say it's a standard is completely ignoring that user pain. The third answer is that users just don't like change. And like that's, of all these 3 things, this is the one I agree with the most. Of course they don't like change, but they didn't like cars. They didn't like computers. Users didn't like mobile phones. And believe it or not, they did not like iPhones when they first came out. Users always don't like change. So that's not controversial. The issue is, what do you do about it? How do you roll it out in a way that is sensitive and doesn't like freak them out and can be done slowly? So this is an important point, but not one that is something something we do easily. So I want to mention this book I'm reading right now called Could, Should, Might, Don't. It's an amazing book about talking about the future. Strongly recommend it. And I'm a little reluctant to go into too much detail because it's 80,000 words of subtleties, but it really, if you're going to talk about the future, it's a nice framework that basically says there's 4 different ways of thinking about the future: could, should, might, and don't. And each of these is positive, and you need all 4 of these to think about the future properly. The problem is that each one has kind of an evil twin. That's kind of not the good way of doing it. So effectively, could is the starry-eyed, sparkly vision of the future, brainstorming all sorts of crazy ass ideas of the future. Almost every single AI post you see on LinkedIn is a could post, right? And not unsurprisingly, it's almost always by men. Ever notice that? No, sorry. I digress. But anyway, the point is that this is an important way to brainstorm, but the twin evil side is what we'll call the fool. You don't really understand it. You don't have the kind of how do we get from here to there. It's all vision and no execution. The more executional side would be the should, which is to say, what is our metric? What is our business metric? What's our kind of customer metric? What is our ethical metric? What are the things that are important for us to actually move forward? And should is very powerful because it gives you kind of a compass point. The negative side is the preacher, that you kind of know what's important and you kind of over-index on that. The classic thing that companies do is you focus on money and customers, and all you do is just focus on whatever it takes to get to the next quarter. It's the economics side of things, which is important, but if you do only that, you shut down any future thinking. The might is more of the consultant idea. What are the possible ways in which we can go? All the positive things, all the negative things. It's this wide variety, but it doesn't have any kind of focus that comes from should. And so the downside there is being the fear monger. Well, this might happen, this might happen. And so you have an unstructured way of thinking about which path to take. And frankly, the most powerful one is don't, which sounds really negative, right? But don't is effectively your core. And I would say in open source, you'd say we don't collect user data, for example, right? It gives you that foundational idea of where you go from there. The downside to that, of course, is being a gatekeeper, that you start to being really structured as to what's going on and you just refuse to let anybody move. So the issue here is these are all important ways of thinking about it. We need all 4 of them, but these 4 are the ones that really slow things down. So when I got the okay boomer comment, that was clearly somebody over-indexing on should. We should do this. Effectively, it's a standard is the gatekeeper. Well, it's already been done before. We don't want to do that. And of course, the fearmonger entirely came from the customers don't like that. So it's helpful for me because when I want to talk about the future, all I get from a lot of people is stuff from here. And I'm trying to say, let's back up. Let's take a breath and let's try to think a little bit more positively about the future. So that's effectively the problem here is that UX improvements, and I mean foundational improvements, right? Not window managers, not icons, not desktop patterns, have stopped. And as I've talked to people about it, few people seem to care or want to do anything about it. And that's why I'm here. I'm saying, can we just care? Can we just try something? And so now clearly there's a lot of work that's happening at Canonical and helping all the customers and all the clients and all the different consistency issues. There's tons of UX work. I'm just saying it's more foundational stuff. So I love this quote from Benjamin Franklin. I actually got this from Brad Frost. If you know him, he's a well-known guy in the design systems world. I got his permission to steal this line. But when you're finished changing, you're finished. And that's the kind of the feeling I want to get here. We should be thinking about not doing that. So because so many people want to focus on the immediate economic issue, I think it's important for me to do a tiny programmer joke to say that exploring isn't a binary, it's a float. And too often people think that exploring has to be this big thing. At Google, we had this rule called the 70-20-10 rule, where 70% was your core work. It's the work that paid the bills. It was bug fixes, it was security patches, and so forth. That's important stuff, and it was the majority of the work that we did. And then 20% was effectively the new incremental features. You just need a few more things every year, keep it growing. But that was like the majority of all of our time. And then this little bit over here was effectively the blue sky work. That was Google X and other stuff like that. Now, I'm not saying that anybody should copy this ratio. I'm saying is, let's just have maybe 0.5%, just a little bit, to working on the future. And I think that would be a more helpful way to have these conversations to say, keep doing your day job, but let's just have a little bit for the future. So That's the problem. Now let's talk about perspective a little bit. I love this quote from Alan Kay that says, perspective is worth 80 IQ points. You're the same person, it's the same world, but when you just understand the problem a little bit better, you're just smarter. And in fact, that's what I think a lot of UX design tries to do. It tries to actually build some perspective. And if we want to talk about the future, I have to kind of talk about the elephant in the room. And the canonical people asked me to talk about this a little bit, which was to say, how can we have UX be a better part of this future? The way I like to phrase it is, I hate the term UX UI with the heat of 1,000 suns. It is the most destructive term we have inflicted upon ourselves because it confuses everybody. So when I started back in the 80s, we called it human interface. And then as things went along, it turned into UI. Same job, we just were kind of like, oh, it's UI now. And then Don Norman and his friends came along and they called it UX. Still design. And then along came Figma and just fucked everything up. Because we needed more UX designers. The industry got flooded with visual designers who got really good at Figma, and they're like, we don't like being called visual designers, so we're going to take this word and we're going to put it over here, and we're going to call it UX UI, and they confused the shit out of everybody. Because what design is 12 different things. It's not 2 things. To break it up into 2 things confuses everybody. And so what do they end up thinking? They think, oh, it's just pixels. If you talk to somebody who's not a designer, they think design is pixels. Here's a proof of this. If you go to open source design, Ariel, are you here? There. She's involved with this. Please talk to her. She's really good at this. And I think she's got this really lovely website. And I went there, and 80% of the jobs were icon and image requests. And it's just so frustrating. In fact, if you really want to piss off a UX designer, this is guaranteed to work. You basically say, UX just makes things pretty. Guaranteed to start a fight, okay? And so there's so much more to it. So I'm trying to make the programmers in the room be more empathetic, so maybe you can understand this. If you go to a party and you say, I'm a programmer, what happens? Most people say, oh, really? You work in IT? Okay. That little feeling of death you just had is how we feel every time you ask us for icons. I just want you to understand kind of where we're coming from here, okay? So if someone misunderstands your job, that's the kind of the feeling we have here. So UX is many, many things. I've written about it down here if you want to have a look at that. But it's what I call the understanding, bridging, flowing, refining groups. User tests, focus groups, surveys, interviews, personas. You're just focusing on the problem and the user. The next is, of course, understanding the technology. Pros and cons of the core tech. What is easy? What is hard? What is important? How do you map what's going on with the user to what the technology is capable of doing? Then you actually do the quote-unquote real UX. How do you flow through the application? Paper sketches, mock-ups, motion studies. You keep discovering what works, what doesn't work, and finally like journey maps. And then you get to the pixels, right? Design systems, color themes, animations, copywriting, and then the end, those damn icons. So there's a lot here before you do icons. And so when you only think we do icons, that's kind of why we get a little pissy, sorry. And so going back to the Alan Kay quote, we're trying to create shared perspective. The whole idea is to say, well, what's important and how does this work and what was better and so forth. So it gives us a higher level of talking about it. In many ways, this is what I'd call designers tend to do the should corner of that matrix I talked to you about. For years, though, I've used this phrase that programmers think mathematically and designers think statistically. And I meant this as a descriptive, positive comment for both. It's not a criticism at all. Programmers tend to be in the might category, right? They're just looking at every possible thing that can go wrong. They don't like bugs. They find every possible problem, right? Designers, of course, think statistically. And in general, this is good. These two things work well together. It should be a positive thing. But unfortunately, they tend to collide a little bit. And so this has happened, I think, to every UX designer in this room. You're in a meeting, you've done all of your work, you present some position you're at, and you get this. Well, like, that's just your opinion, man. And that is so frustrating because it kind of devalues everything that you have done. And it misunderstands what you're trying to do. So my point here is that if we want to think about the future, right, we have to understand that both of these are important and they have a tendency to collide, but they shouldn't. And it's so easy to get around that. We should basically the lack of trust is the most destructive force on any team. And so if you can get it so that the programmers trust the engineers, and the engineers trust the designers, and the designers trust the programmers, everything goes so much better. Let me give you an example of what I did recently at Mastodon. We were doing quote posts, something we just added recently to Mastodon. And the idea was that there was a paper written a couple years ago from Twitter that said, in order to avoid dunking and toxic quote posting, the idea was to put the introduction below because we wanted to de-escalate effectively toxic negative posts. Huge, horrible discussions because people were arguing about which way. So we did some research and found out that actually the vast majority of quote posts are positive. And when we talked to underrepresented communities, they really needed it above the line because they're building followings, they're building people, and they needed to introduce it so people knew why this person was important. And so all of a sudden we changed our perspective from you're moving it down here to reduce harm to if you put it here, you reduce the ability for people to do good. People didn't know that there was actually harm in moving it to the bottom. And once we found that, the conversation was so much easier. And so we actually did move it to the top. Now, there are other things that we did to help reduce dunking. I don't want to get into that detail. But until we had that perspective, we couldn't have the conversation. So the whole idea then is to basically try to move this in the same direction. I know this is a very meta point to make right here, but if we don't have this conversation, we can't move forward with anything else. So moving to learning loops. There is a psychological principle that was written up by a guy named Ralph Koster, and he did this theory of fun. He's a well-known game designer. He did Ultima Online back in the 90s, if you're familiar with that one. He's working on a new game called Stars Reach, and the best job I ever had was when Google allowed me to interview him, and I turned his book into a series of UX desktop guidelines and the similarities between game design and that. And so I wrote it up here if you want to look about it. But the fun part about it was that he talks about one particular thing that applies a lot to desktop, which is learning loops. It's a psychological term. It's been in psychology for years, where you have a mental model. The user has a mental model, and they have an intent. So then they look on the screen, and they find an affordance to do their action, and they get a result, which gives them feedback. And then what happens is you go back the loop and you learn. So if you click on a button and you miss it, you go, well, okay, well, then you click on it and it highlights. Okay. And you learn how these things work. And the visual interaction teaches you things. And it's a very subtle, very tiny thing. And I love his way of phrasing this. He goes, fun is just another word for learning. And so he really basically pushes this in his games that you have to teach people how to use your product, and the more they learn, the more fun they have. I think that's a very powerful idea. So the way he talks about this was going back to the OG game, Super Mario, and Super Mario Brothers, is you really just have a left and right and a jump button when you start off, and you're behind actually this little pipe, and you kind of go back and forth, like this is kind of boring. Right. And you learn to jump, and then you still get stuck, and eventually you learn to time your jump to go on top. You've learned your first loop, right, to be with time and jump. Then when you get over to these area above, if you hold the jump button down a little bit longer, then you jump into it, and you hit this thing, and you get a power-up, right? And then when you finally get to the monster, you're like, oh, I've been jumping enough. Maybe if I time it just right, I can land on him, and then boom. So what you've done is with one button, jump, you've now basically moved, pushed, and attacked, as opposed to the naive programmer approach would be to say I have 3 buttons that do all 3 functions. But no, they're trying to do everything with one button, and I think that's very subtle and it's fun, right? And of course, Nintendo, this is their secret sauce. They do this for every single game. So whether it's basically Super Mario Odyssey or Splatoon. In fact, there's a quote from their lead designer that said they spend 80% of their development time just getting these loops right, and then 20% doing all of the levels in the whole game, which I found to be astounding, right? So why do I care? This seems pretty esoteric, I assume. Well, it's because if there's one thing I've seen in my career is that the most common product mistake is rushing. People just go, and they just cram things in, put in more menu items, put in more icons. They don't step back, and especially when it comes to desktop, because we're doing a lot of dragging and clicking and so forth. And there's so many ways that we could make this much more nuanced, and loops is a very powerful way to do that. So I applied this to my research at Google. I applied to mobile text editing. We knew that there was a problem with text editing, and so we did a user study. This is actually a recording of a user trying to get rid of this second space. And we ran this through 12 people, and we stopped because after 12 people getting it wrong 12 times, we didn't need to test any more people. It was so bad that effectively what ended up happening was this is one of the good ones. They had 5 attempts. They would tap to the right, tap to the left. They had an accidental drag. They would bring up the menu, and they finally got it. There was so much going on here, we knew we had a problem. And part of it was because mobile text editing is a very naive copy of desktop. Someone thought that if you just made touch the equivalent of click, everything would be cool. That's not the case at all. So we stepped back a little bit and said, desktop has amazing loops, right? You start with click, which is admittedly is very, very boring, right? And then you go to drag, where you click and drag to do your selection. And then after you do that, you can do double click, which is to then actually do something more quickly. And so the idea is that you're still clicking, but each layer just gives you a little bit more. You're a little bit more productive. And so the important thing to understand here, though, is that this boring base is powerfully consistent. It's always a click, and we always underestimate how important consistency is. And the problem with mobile is that when they just simply said, oh, tap is the equivalent of click, they didn't understand that with no mouse, no menu bar, no command keys, you ended up having 4 possible actions happen when you tapped on this. This is why people hate text editing on mobile. Further studies, we found out that people actually refused, in many cases, they would rather just select all, delete, and retype than actually edit. Or they would start an email on their phone and they'd finish it on their desktop. So the whole purpose of my research was to say, how could we get around this naive understanding? So what we did was we added a new event. We added effectively a force press, which is, iPhone had one for a while. And the idea then was to simply say we combined dragging, the magnifier, and a force press so that with one movement you could move the cursor, start a highlight, and move, and with just one pass. And we tested this, it worked out really, really well. But because we wanted to really go after power users as well, we added effectively a gesture keyboard. It's a little bit like pie menus, if you're familiar with that. But the idea is that after you select it, you can actually get a menu. And then the idea was you could get the equivalent of copy and paste with just a flick gesture. This tested remarkably well, did very, very well. And if you really want to hear more about the video and what I did, jenson.org/go/text will give you the video of this. But I don't want to tell you about my text editing work. I'm just trying to say is this is an example of loops. The idea was we wanted to have a certain kind of tap, a drag, and a press, and each one built upon the other one. And this is the kind of fundamental desktop UX work we could be thinking about, is to think at this level, right? So unlike apps, I think OS interactions are far more subtle, and especially because if you do them right, every app uses them. So the moral of the story is don't rush, get perspective, and try to think more in loops. So let me give you a quick demo, actually. I intentionally made a toy window manager. It's so bad you can't dislike it because you know it's not real. So don't look too hard. I'm trying to demonstrate this idea of what loops can be like. So imagine you have a window manager you open and then you close it by clicking this little thing here. And that's the classic thing to do today. The problem, of course, is that you have to click this little tiny button. Now, maybe if you want to be fancy, you can double click on the title bar. You can do that. But the whole point, though, is that you want to have this space is for the application. So now to do window management, you've got to hit these tiny little targets. Well, what would happen? Hear me out. You have a new button on the mouse. Okay, I know you're going to want to say use the super key. Fine, use the super key. But like pretend you actually had a real button on the mouse. What could you do with that button? So you click anywhere and it would go away. Now, this seems really boring. This is like a click, right? Of course it's boring, but it's consistent. It works across the board. Now what would happen is if I were to take it, click, and now I click and I drag. If I drag to the left, it highlights to say, oh, I'll put it there. If I tap to the right, it'll go over here. Now all of a sudden we have this idea of locations and destinations. I'm choosing 2 now. We could do other ones. This could be a far more sophisticated window manager with lots of depth, and this is effectively your temporary palette. Lots of different directions that you could go. But just by going from click to click and drag, I've now unlocked this ability. And now once I have the ability to push things around with this gesture, what would happen if I actually went to, say, a text editor, obviously a fake text editor, and I were to then do this special click on the text, I now have a visual clipboard. It pops over to the same place. And if I put it away, and I go over to, say, a file manager window, I click on that, then I can actually move the actual image there. Now, when I, again, put this away, open this up, now I can actually take these things and drag them in and so forth. So I've now effectively crossed the boundaries between a window manager, a clipboard manager, and a file manager. And I'm not saying this is the right idea. I don't want to sell you on this idea too much. I just want to say it's because of these loops. I went from click to drag to a deeper click. When you think like loops, you can actually approach an OS like this in a more nuanced way. That's the point I'm trying to get. So ignore my pixels, right? So thinking. Really killing my mojo here. There it goes. Okay, so I finished learning loops. Now possible solutions. I've made a specific point of not trying to come in here and telling you what you should do. That would imply I'm selling something. I'm trying to be more meta here to talk about how to talk about this. But let me start off what I'm not suggesting. I'm not suggesting that AI is the answer. We should just dump AI into everything. Okay, I have very strong opinions on this. I feel we're headed towards a very strong AI crash, but that's a personal opinion of mine. So I just think for the moment, especially the way it's done, it's not ethically trained, it's not preserving information, the fact that it's burning up the planet. There's lots of reasons, even if it does succeed. But I do recommend you check out Ed Zitron, who has a lot of really strong arguments about, from a business point of view, this is doomed. He doesn't even go into the technology. He just, from a business point of view, this is doomed. And but I'm not here to talk about that. I'm just trying to say that's not going to be the focus of this talk. I think but I do think that something will come after the bubble. This is not a doomed technology. The first iteration is a doomed implementation of it. So if you're familiar with StarCoder, it's effectively an ethically trained programmer model. It's really quite nice. The Swiss government is doing Apertus. These are small language models that are really ethically done. They're very well organized. I think there's a lot of value to these. They are not as powerful as the big foundational models, but that's asking the wrong question. We don't need these things to take the bar exam. We need these things to do text analysis and basic stuff. So if we have more modest goals, run it locally, and it's ethically trained, this makes an awful lot more sense. Because I think the world has gotten kind of balkanized into the complete Kool-Aid drinkers that think general AI is coming, which I think is a load of crock, and then the people that want to burn it with fire, right? And I don't think either side is correct. We need it somewhere in the middle. And I do believe small language models that are ethically trained and run locally have a lot of potential. I wrote about this. This is my last blog post. I got a lot of traction. And it's about effectively boring is actually good. If we actually have more modest goals with small language models, we can do some really powerful things. The other thing I want to avoid is blue sky, far out stuff. Even though, I don't know if you know Dynamic Land. It is an awesome project by Brett Victor. It's basically physical computing. Definitely check it out. Super exciting stuff, but it's way out there. So my point here is no large AI, no grand visions. I just want us to have a little perspective as to how we want to think about what does it mean to be a better desktop UX. So think about it this way. We've got the command line down here. We've got Dynamic Land up there. Well, what's the desktop? Well, the desktop is right about here. So my point is, how do we just grow it a little bit, right? Just go out a little bit there. And it helps to take a look at two different versions that tried to grow it. Does anybody remember Windows Tablet from the 90s? It didn't do so well. It was a subset of the desktop, but it was a strict subset, right? It had scroll bars and it had keyboards and all sorts of stuff like that. And it didn't do quite so well, whereas the iPhone did something very special that I don't think people really realize. They kind of colored outside the lines. And this little magic bit hasn't been discussed much because it was a subset of desktop and they added something to it. What they added was the scroll event was greater than the tap event. And I'm always surprised people don't talk about this. When you tap on the thing, the first thing you do is scroll. The tap only happens when you lift up. That's why text editing is so bad on mobile, because they prioritized scrolling. Now, it made it a consumption machine, and it made it super awesome. I'm not trying to say it was a bad choice, but this was the unique thing they did that was not a subset. Well, of course, they also added cubic decay scrolling, which makes it so much fun. I mean, everybody who got an iPhone went, whee! right? Because that was cool, right? And so the iPhone is a consumption-based machine, right? And that's awesome, and it's good for consumers, but it's not good for productivity. So we have to color outside the lines, and that's what scares people. Remember that Star Wars scene, the original Star Wars, when they're all trapped, and the stormtroopers are shooting them, and Princess Leia grabs the blaster and blasts a hole in the floor, and they all jump in the trash compactor? Okay, that's what it feels like when you color outside the lines. If you do something that no one else has done before, you're jumping into the trash compactor. But how can we be Princess Leia? We need to be Princess Leia. We need to try some of these more crazy things. And I know it's hard, but how can we do these experiments in such a way that we don't feel like we're taking so much of a risk? Some of my stuff at Google was not shipping, and I was quite frustrated. I talked to a VP about it, and he said something I'll never forget. He goes, "The fastest way to ship your features is to have Apple do it first." Thanks, Mr. Senior Visionary Guy. It was so frustrating but that's why we were copying desktop in the first place, because they took all of the pressure off of us. And yet we have to think more about that. And that's why copying is so powerful. So it just helps to pause and back up a bit. The delta from the original Mac to the Mac Studio is enormous. The original Mac screen, the physical Mac screen, is nearly the same size as an iPad mini. That blew my mind when I realized that. The original Mac was really small. And yet, all the things that have happened since then, right? We have 75,000 times more RAM. We have 2.5 million times more storage, and we have 100 million times faster CPUs. And yet, we're kind of doing the same shit we were doing back in 1984. It feels like we could burn a few more cycles. Dynamic Land has this really lovely point. I don't want to copy their research, but they have a nice mindset, which is buy the most expensive computers you can to prototype, and you can buy the future. Because it takes many years for the software to really figure out what it wants to do. And in that time, the hardware will probably catch up to you. And in fact, I just kind of wanted to make sure I talked at Mark's point about working with a 5-year bet that the chip makers are doing. They are going to be somewhere really amazing in 5 years. Why aren't we assuming that we can do something equally cool with it? Why are they going to want to do 10-year-old stuff with 5-year-old CPUs? We should be doing more stuff with those CPUs and trying that out now. Now, like I said before, I don't want to give you specific ideas because there's a lot of reasons, but I want to give you 3 prototype concepts. And then we can talk about deconstruct. What is easy about it? What is hard about it? What's the interest level? Who does this help? Could this encourage funding? So after this talk is over, I would encourage anybody here to have these same 3 concepts and walk through and just see what comes out as a workshop. So let's take an easy one. KDE Connect 2.0. Right? This is completely Princess Leia proof, right? Everybody loves this feature on Macintosh. It's what motivated it in the first place. People like KDE Connect. It's a good product, but it has a few issues, right? It doesn't quite work very well on Wi-Fi. It's hard to set up. And this is no shade on KDE Connect. It's a small team. They can only do so much. But what would happen if we said, you know what? We really like this idea. What would it take to really make it great? Right? And so it asks questions like, well, are phone users important? iPhone has a much better SDK than iPhone does. What would happen if we just did Android, because we could just do so much more on iPhone? What about the fact that we tend to always over-index on programmers? What would happen if we actually thought about consumers a little bit? Would that be? These are the questions that I can't answer for you, but I think should be discussed, because if you did a little bit of work, I think there could be an amazing version of KDE Connect, but it would take a little bit of work to think about what kinds of lower level hacks would be necessary. And maybe you don't boil the ocean and completely have a universal set of hardware interfaces that works across all Wi-Fi chips. Maybe you do something like a Bluetooth handoff that's a bit of a hack, but you do something and you kind of build this out. So this to me is an interesting experiment that should be on the easy side. The more medium thing would be a super windowing system. And I don't mean a 37th windowing system. I mean something that actually colors outside the lines, that talks about effectively how users flow with their data through history and data and files and time. And it's important that you don't rush to solutions on this one, right? what user research is there? Can we talk about the problems that people are having with file management and version management and application management? And then what can we build fast? Because someone pointed out to me that Wayland is now, 14 years old? It's finally shipping, right? Wayland? I heard it's shipping soon, right? Maybe Wayland can actually build some of these things that cross all of these boundaries. And so rush to experiments. Don't try to ship something in a month. Just build something, try it out, see how it feels. Now the last one is one I know no one's going to like, but I'm doing it intentionally to provoke some discussion, right? Windows Recall got an awful lot of bad press, but like I said before, it was its execution that was bad. If we had a local language model and we could actually do it securely, privately on your device, and you could basically start to have the user's history, the clipboard, what predictions could be useful. Could we do it through could we build the ultimate right click? What about the clipboard manager that the Windows guys are talking about? There's all sorts of directions that can be done, and this would be a whole series of experiments, but it flips the whole problem on its head by making the small language model local on the device. But this is clearly more difficult because it probably requires some APIs that don't exist, right? But again, small, tiny experiments that could be used in such a way that do that. So I'm almost done. I've got 6 minutes. This is open source. How in hell can we do this? Right? We have no money. We have no people. What are you smoking, Scott? Well, I want to point out a company called Ink and Switch. They do basically open source research. They are the ones that are behind CRDTs, if you know that. It's an amazing technology. I actually did a project for them 2 years ago called Upwelling, which is one of the early CRDT things. Actually, I think I could have put this in the easy, medium, hard category too. I just didn't have time. But they have a lovely model, which is you fund small teams, 1 to 3 people, and they basically have a tight focus for 4 months. And the whole idea is you spend 3 of those months building something, anything, fast, right? And then a whole month, writing up a paper about it. And that's really important because it causes you to stop, think, and when you write, you actually end up learning and you reflect on what happened and you say, what went well, what went bad, what should we do? And then it wraps up and they publish it as an open source paper. All the code is open source, the paper's open source, and really lovely things happen, primarily because you can then do version 2. But on top of that, they get universities that take that and kind of go, that's cool. Can we build something on top of that? Now, all of a sudden, you're building effectively an open source research community. So it's not just simply 1 or 2 things, but a lot. So I think it's a very powerful way to magnify learning. And they're doing it on a dime. They're doing very, very low income. So it's a very powerful way that's very open source. So I think that should be considered as a role model for this kind of work. So that's basically the summary of my talk. Basically, I talked about the problem that Apple and Microsoft are not leading the way and things are not fine. I want us to know that and actually try to care about that a little bit. The perspective, of course, is that we need perspective and we need effectively UX and programmers to work together in a trusting way. Without that, nothing is possible. And learning loops, especially with operating systems, are an incredibly powerful way to build very nuanced ways to do this. And finally, this idea that we have to be like Princess Leia. We have to be willing to blow some holes and jump into a trash compactor and try these various things and a possible funding model. So all I want us to do is to try, and that's why I was here. And I'm happy to talk to you guys more about this later. Thank you very much.